Welcome everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. I'm Nina Johnson with the National Center on Early Childhood Quality Assurance. We're really excited to present this webinar focused on the approaches that can help ensure high quality early learning for dual language learner children. We have a large and a very diverse audience, and we hope that each of you will find something in this presentation that sparks your interest and deepens your knowledge. The Early Childhood Quality Assurance Center is committed to issues of culturally and linguistically responsive practices and racial equity, and we are pleased to have the opportunity to add to the growing library of resources on dual language learners. I'm very pleased to introduce Miriam Calderon, who will lead this webinar. Miriam is Build's lead on work related to dual language learners. So Miriam, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Nina. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. This webinar has three main parts today. We're going to begin with overviewing some research conducted by the Build initiative around dual language learners and state early learning and development standards. We want to hear from 3 states that are deeply immersed in this work related to building their systems to better respond to research related to dual language learners. And we want to highlight resources that can support you in your efforts, and in particular a new federal policy statement related to dual language learners. So I want to start by quickly introducing our presenters. We're fortunate to have Nicole Rose from Washington State with us. As part of Nicole's many responsibilities, she has been really immersed in driving work related to a program standards alignment that presented a very important opportunity in her state to build a stronger system for dual language learners. So I'm excited that she's here and can share that with you. We have Annemarie Weis from West Ed. Annemarie, as part of her work, provides capacity building and technical assistance to the state of California related to dual language learners, and that includes work on California's statewide formative assessment and KEA, which she'll be talking about later on in the webinar. And we have Noel McNerney from South Carolina. Noel has been both engaged with both Build's dual language learner learning table and a learning table on equity, and has really used resources from both of those experiences to advance work related to dual language learners in her state, and she's going to share that with us later on. And last but not least, we are really pleased to have a representative from the federal government with us and the Administration for Children and Families, Office of Head Start, who is doing a tremendous amount of work around culturally and linguistically responsive practice, including with our federal national technical assistance centers. So I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to talk a little bit about our new policy statement.
Hi, Miriam. Thank you so much. And if you could do me a favor before I provide an overview about the DLL Joint Policy Statement, do you mind just moving my PowerPoint presentation? My computer just died. That would be greatly appreciated.
Yes, I just did. You're all set.
Hi, everybody. Buenas tardes. I'm Jennifer Amaya Thompson. I'm really excited to be here today and have the opportunity to highlight some of the great work that the Department of Health and Human Services, in collaboration with the Department of Education, are doing to support the development of children who are dual language learners in early childhood programs. Specifically, I'm really excited to talk to you today about the Dual Language Learners Joint Policy Statement and recommendations recently released by both departments to support dual language learners. As you might probably already know, the Joint DLL Policy Statement is a joint vision, a shared vision at the federal level that all early childhood programs adequately and effectively serve the children who are dual language learners as well as their families. These children make up our country and our nation as well. The DLL Joint Policy Statement outlines the federal vision to advance the state practices by setting expectations for high quality and appropriate support and services, specifically are designed for young dual language learners. Again, the policy also highlights and increased awareness about the benefits of bilingualism and the important role of home language development. And the policy itself is based on research on the unique strengths and challenges that dual language learners face on a daily basis, as well as effective strategies that promote learning and development. And the other two important pieces within the DLL Joint Statement policy is that it also provides recommendations recommendations to early childhood programs strives and states on establishing policies and implementing practices that support the learning and the development of children who are dual language learners. The joint policy statement as well provide considerations for tribal communities to be engaged in native language revitalization, maintenance, restoration, or preservation efforts within early childhood programs. And as well, which is always very important to all of us, is that this policy statement helps us to identify the free resources that support the work that we do to support dual language learners. And I think that that is mainly what I wanted to highlight. In the most important part, I just wanted to thank you for the work that you do on a daily basis to serve dual language learners in early childhood programs. And just to keep in mind that these children are our future. So thank you so much for the work that you do. And once again, I'm excited to be here with you today. And I'm turning it back to you, Miriam.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. This is a very important policy statement, and we will come back to this throughout the webinar when we talk more about resources. Our hope really for all of you in this webinar is that you walk away really recognizing the handles that you have to build support for work related to dual language learners and improvements in policy and practice. I think we can all agree that this is really among the many racial equity issues that we work on, one where we have the benefit of having significant and growing research to guide policy and practice change. And so with this base, we really need to identify the opportunities and how we can leverage research and make stronger connections to policy and practice. One of the real issues that we know beyond the research base is that we really have a demographic imperative. As this next slide shows in Figure 1, from 1990, we had 14% of all children in the United States born to children of immigrants, and between 2011 and 2013, we saw that increase to 25%. As you can see from the slide and the graphic, it is not isolated to a handful of states that we think of as traditional states where we see linguistically diversity. This is across the board, and some of the biggest increases and changes throughout that period are, in our southeastern states and midwestern states and states where, we might not expect that our early childhood systems are serving a large number of dual language learners. I should just note that data on young dual language learners before school entry are really estimates, and we use a number of different proxies like number of children of immigrants or children, young children that reside in linguistically isolated households. So again, I think it's important to think about your own access to data as you think about how you might estimate the population in your own states, and there are various ways to do that. The federal policy statement has some figures. As you see here, this data is from Migration Policy Institute that can serve as an important resource as well. So with that, I'm going to move right into talking about some work that I conducted with Dr. Linda Espinosa at the BUILD initiative. We recognize that early learning and development standards are an important entry point in your state for policy and practice improvements, and we think as well for advancing this work around dual language learners. As you know, early learning and development standards set the expectations for what children should know and be able to do. They guide decisions around curriculum, assessment, and instruction, and they are informed by our research on children's development. So with this research, we kind of sought to answer the question, how well are states' early learning and development standards reflecting the current research related to dual language learners and addressing their needs. We looked at states that either had a high proportion of dual language learners. We looked at states that were involved with build around some assessment work. And so in the end, we looked at 23 states, including the District of Columbia. We looked at the standards documents themselves for what they said related to dual language learners. And then we looked at materials that were related to the standards. So other guidance, curriculum frameworks, statewide training on standards to get a better idea of how states were sort of building out their vision and supporting programs in implementing and using their standards. So I'll start to talk a little bit about what we found. As we looked at the standards document themselves, it was easily kind of obvious to us that we could classify the states into 3 different approaches. One approach, the dual language development approach, we know is one that is really highly aligned with the research and is our sort of best practice in really supporting children's early bilingualism and biliteracy. The English language development approach, which has an explicit goal of English language acquisition, but also includes intentional support for home language development, and then English immersion. And so I should mention that the federal policy statement that Jennifer talked about has more information about these approaches as well, as does the build report. So what we found is that of these 23 states, 1 state in their standards themselves really articulated a vision for dual language development for children in their state. We had 16 states that talked about and really discussed the research around the importance of supporting the home language for children to be readers and writers and speakers in English. And then we had 5 states that we classified as English immersion states. I should mention that among the English immersion states, we didn't find any state that had, an affirmative statements about English-only instruction. It was more about kind of the absence of including information in their standards about how development is different from a monolingual child and a bilingual child. We also looked at how then, after classifying the states in the report, how states aligned this vision as articulated in their standards of dual language development or English language development with other policies or guidance. So that's when we looked at some of the other materials or documents that we could find sort of related to standards. And so we looked at these different criteria. So what kind of philosophical statement did they include about dual language learners? And often we saw really nice summaries of the research that states included in their standards. What states said about, how states provided guidance around specific teaching practices or strategies to support dual language learners. What states said about family engagement and how to partner with families of DLLs. Recommendations around assessment, whether or not dual language learners were referenced in the social emotional domain, what states may or may not have said about who's qualified to teach DLLs in their state, how they're identified as dual language learners. And so, again, these are defined in the build report. If you look at these and all of there is a state table so you can easily reference. If you're looking, for example, at family engagement, you can see excerpts of, what those 7 states and what exactly explicitly they said about dual language learners as it relates to family engagement. I think some of this is highlights and takeaways for me as I look at this is there was a lot of information in language and literacy and communication domain and more guidance related to supporting dual language learners than, say, you would find in the social emotional domain. And, as we got more into specifics about assessment, how their children are identified, who's qualified to teach, we didn't have as many states kind of providing that kind of guidance. An important point that we make in the report is while the philosophy statement, the summaries of the research, and the overall approach is important to have in your standards, with just leaving it there and not really building it out and creating that kind of specificity, I think, and consistency within the rest of the documents that we provide to practitioners and programs on the ground, people will be unlikely to know what to do. And so I'm excited today that we've got 3 states that are really deeply kind of immersed in that work of, further building out their visions and or building from that vision and moving into some of these program criteria and, essentially moving from really the research and the philosophy to sort of more intentional action. So now we want to hear from you, and we would like to do a quick poll and ask folks to think about what are the factors that are critical in influencing your state's vision for young dual language learners. So, great. Jen, should I give a little bit more time or?
Yeah, it looks like only 8 people have responded, so maybe give it another couple seconds. Oh, maybe
Great,
it's a little more than 8. You can kind of see the number over on the right there.
Great. So English-only laws, attitudes towards immigrants, demographic changes, K-12 policies, the research on the benefits of bilingualism, our workforce capacity, different advocacy groups, and state leadership. So it looks like our sort of K-12 system, the research, and our sort of immigrant policies or attitudes around immigrants seem to be the biggest influencers. And it looks like, Jen, I saw some folks maybe having a hard time voting. So, when their survey came up.
Yeah, I think the poll got closed early, I think, so I think that's what happened.
Okay, well, my apologies about that. But again, it's important, we hope, for you to sort of reflect on this and develop some awareness around what those factors are. And I think you'll hear from Noel a little bit later on as she talks about some of her work in South Carolina in particular. It's important to sort of have this kind of context as you think about the levers and the opportunities or where these kind of influences come from so that you can really be an actor in your state about creating change. So thank you for those that were able to participate. Now I'm excited to turn it over to Nicole from Washington State. And I'll just remind folks that as Noel is presenting, please put your questions. I'll be monitoring the chat box, and we'll take a couple questions for Nicole at the end of her presentation.
Great. Thanks, Miriam. It's great to be on the call. As she said, I'm the Assistant Director for Quality Practice and Professional Growth at DEL, and that houses our quality work, our state-funded preschool, and our professional development work. So it's the perfect place to really be talking about how we move forward dual language strategies in Washington State. On this slide, you see what is a happy picture of our governor signing what is known as the Early Start Act in Washington State. And this was a historic piece of legislation that's really putting an eye towards quality for our most vulnerable children and families in Washington State. We had already started some work around standards alignment before this was passed and had some conversations throughout this with our local partners, including One America, our Child Care Aware of Washington, to really think about how we support the work of dual language learners in Washington State. The passage of this act really gave us an opportunity to further align those standards. So we want to look at how we align child care licensing, our state-funded preschool standards, all within the quality framework of Early Achievers, our quality rating and improvement system. And the goal of this is to really think about how are we streamlining things for providers, for families, and how do we take this as an opportunity to take some of those things we may have been doing in state-funded preschool and apply those across all of our settings. So we have been busily working on some drafts of this, which I will show you soon. One of the things we felt was really important as we were doing this work is that we needed to have some guiding principles. And one of those guiding principles was cultural humility. And you'll see that theme throughout a lot of the work that we have been doing on this. So as we've worked on these aligned standards, we've met with our public-private partnerships, Thrive Washington, Child Care Aware, our early learning regional coalitions, our provider community, and also worked in partnership with the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction to ensure as we were moving this work forward that our terms and the way that we were talking about things were aligned. And what you see here really is a selection of proposed standards that are related to dual language learners. We had some of this information in our state-funded preschool, but as we worked with BUILD over the course of 2015 and began this work and really thinking deeply about how we align these standards, we are looking at this across more than just how does this look in the classroom. What does this look in program administration and oversight? How are we engaging with families this way? We have a very nice philosophical statement in our early learning guidelines, but this is really about how do we put these things into practice. So it's that move from research to implementation. So these selections of standards that you're seeing up here are being discussed in the community right now, and we're looking to implement these in 2018. Part of what we want to be really cognizant about is how do we ensure that providers have resources to actually implement these, and it becomes something more than just words on a page. But we're talking about things like being aware and responsive to children's linguistic and cultural needs, encouraging language development by incorporating these things into the daily routine, really thinking about how we're learning from families about goals that are appropriate for them and taking into consideration the child and family's linguistic needs. As part of the Early Start Act, we were also asked to really look at what are some culturally responsive guidelines for professional development. So we have our Washington Administrative Code, where our licensing rules live. We have our ECAP performance standards, and those are really about how are you interacting with children and with families. And we also knew that we needed to look at how are we asking our early learning professionals to practice this in their professional development, and how are we setting up pathways to make that happen. We also want to really honor the diversity of children and families that we're serving and think about how do we continue to have our teaching staff reflect the children and families that they serve. So we always want to have a culturally responsive lens as we're looking at professional development. And so this was a work group that, again, brought together a variety of people from higher education, from community organizations, our school-age community, as well as Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction and our early learning providers. And what they came up with were guidelines for people to use as they think about putting professional development out into the system. And so I'll highlight just a couple of these. Again, you see this cultural humility thread that's going through this. And this is really about being open to new information and knowledge, following cultural protocol, which is available in the public domain, seeking knowledge about histories, traditions, values, family systems, and artistic expressions. So really understanding sort of where people are coming from. I think as we do work around dual language learners and racial equity in particular, self-awareness is a huge thing for us all to really be thinking about. And so that ability to reflect on one's own privilege, personal values, perceptions, and beliefs, and to really think about, you know, are there some implicit biases, and then how do we maneuver around those, and what are the areas and opportunities for professional growth. The other one I spoke briefly about is that, you know, we really want to think about how we have a diverse workforce. In Washington State, we are about to more than double the size of our state-funded preschool. And we know that we have thousands of children in licensed child care settings. So how do we make sure that where children are receiving those early services are reflective of the community and cultures within what they live. And we know that in order to do any of this work, that we really count on our community partners. And so in Washington State, we are really trying to make sure we are doing really good state to local coordination and really recognizing who are the key messengers in our communities to help us guide the work that we need to do and make sure that it's relevant as it reaches the children and families who need it most. One of the things that I mentioned previously is that we felt it was really important to have common language. And we think that the standards alignment work is the perfect opportunity to create the common language as well as the culturally responsive guidelines. And so these are some definitions that we have agreed upon in Washington State. You have them here on your screen. But this is, again, a big lesson that we've learned is that if we aren't all speaking the same language, it's hard to move something forward. And so this gives us that common starting place and ability to move the work forward in Washington. So in thinking about some of the things that we've been doing, we have quite a few big next steps here in Washington over the next couple of years. As we continue to look at standards alignment and at also our early learning guidelines and core competencies for our early learning professionals, we want to make sure that honoring home language is incorporated in there and that we're incorporating current research, and then that we're also supporting educators to build language in a child's native language as a priority. So we want to keep that home language piece and really put a focus on that and give educators the tools that they need to do that. We are doing a dual language brain trust with our partners at the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, and that is happening in October. And this is really an opportunity to build on the federal statement that has just come out and make a statement for Washington State as a whole. As we do our work with licensed child care providers, with state-funded preschool, with family, friends, and neighbor care, as kids are going into kindergarten, making sure that we have the best approach to support dual language learners through that process. So the group will come together, discuss what is happening now, what's best for children and families in our state, and what should be in a coordinated state plan moving forward. And we have someone coming in to help consult and do some work with us around that. One thing I want to say that's actually not on the slide that we're actually paying a lot of attention to as well is we're looking at how we are assessing children and assessing dual language learners in particular. We've recently had a Director of Research and Evaluation come on here at the department, and so that's given us a way to look at our state-funded preschool whole child assessment data and our kindergarten entry assessment data in a new way. And so again, we're working with our partners to really ensure that we're using the most appropriate strategies to assess dual language learners so that our outcomes really reflect what children know and are able to do. Another next step for us is really putting those cultural guidelines in action. And so the people who use those guidelines are our state-approved trainers. So when early learning professionals are accessing training, we make sure that there is some consistency in how they're doing that. Our higher education partners will use this as they look at some of their courses and ongoing professional development across Washington State. We will continue to use this at the state level, and our goal is to continue to work with community partners to have this be a resource and tool as they're looking at professional development throughout the community. As I talked about the DLL Brain Trust, the goal for that is, again, really to lead into a dual language learner's statement or policy with a Washington-specific focus. And it's really great that we have the federal policy that we can build upon and then make that with input from our community and stakeholders really relevant to Washington State to really continue to guide our early learning work to, again, best support children and families in Washington State.
Thank you so much, Nicole. We have a couple questions, a lot of reactions to the term cultural humility. Could you just say a little bit more about how that is defined in Washington State, and maybe some resources that you might recommend for folks to learn more about cultural humility?
Absolutely. So this actually came out of our standards alignment group, and I think we had originally used the word culturally responsive, and our group members really talked about it's more than just being culturally responsive. It is really about, in some respects, being open to what you don't know and learning new things. And we think it just has sort of a deeper meaning and value, and really is honoring more of the knowledge and valuable resources of the variety of cultures in Washington State. I'm happy to send some follow-up information. I don't have it in front of me right now about some different resources that we've looked at around that.
That would be great. Thank you, Nicole. There's also a question about the DLL Brain Trust, and could you say more about who members of that would be and who you're engaging in that effort?
Yes. So members of that right now are really likely going to be Office of Superintendent folks, Department of Early Learning members, most likely our higher education partners in Washington State, as well as Child Care Aware, Thrive Washington, our public-private partners. So this is coming up in the next couple of weeks, and we're finalizing all of the details around that. And one other thing I would add to that is I would say that a lot of these things are really beginning conversations. They're sort of the catalyst to get things going, but they certainly won't be the last conversation.
Great, thank you. And then we're going to just take one more question. There's a lot more here. Well, maybe I'll do two and see if we can do them both really quickly. But one is sort of just related to sort of infants and toddlers, and sort of across all the things you've talked about. Could you say anything more briefly about how you're integrating your sort of infant and toddler?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good question, because a lot of times things do sometimes become preschool focused. As we're doing our standards alignment work, that actually goes from birth to 5. So as we're looking at those new and proposed rules, we are looking at what does this look like in an infant classroom, what does it look like in a toddler classroom. So that is something that we're taking into consideration.
Great. And then it's sort of a question around just the actual process in the standards alignment of including these sort of expectations related to dual language learners. Sort of, can you say a little bit more about what that process was like, what you drew from, and also when the standards alignment might be available for other states to be able to see?
Sure. So I'll take the first part around sort of what did the process look like as we were drawing from information to incorporate the dual language pieces. So a lot of that came from the participation we had in the Build Dual Language Learning Table. And so we drew from the plans that we had made from there and incorporated those into drafts of the standards. So we had writing teams here at the Department of Early Learning who would draft portions of standards, and then we have a process where we have an advisory committee made up of community members across the state of Washington, where they've had a chance to give input on those standards. There were times where they had input on draft pieces, and then the community has had a chance to review the entire standards as a whole. There are some pieces around our standards that are on our website, and I'm happy to follow up with the exact link of where you can find that. Our standards alignment process is really thinking about a progression. And so right now what we have done in the standards alignment process is we have proposed rules, or our Washington Administrative Code for licensing. We're in the process right now of building on those rules, so building on that progression and thinking about what will this look like in a site that's participating in Early Achievers, our quality rating and improvement system, and then what will this look like in a state-funded preschool. And so information on those two things will come out later, but there is some information right now that's available on the proposed rules.
Thank you so much, Nicole. There's several more questions in the chat box if you want to take a glance at that now. That we'll be turning over to Annemarie, who is going to talk about assessment. Annemarie?
Good morning, good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. So I'm going to talk to you today about California and in general the early learning and development system and how the state has really done a concerted effort to focus on dual language learners, and in particular talking about the formative assessment instrument that has been part of the state for many years, but in the past 5 to 7 years has really gone through a process of being aligned to the standards. So let's get started just with a little bit of background related, reiterating some of what Miriam has said. And I am going to have to, let's see if I can get this to advance. Great, okay. So, as we've heard today from Miriam and the report that she produced with Dr. Linda Espinosa, we know that young dual language learners are a sizable and growing population, both nationally and especially here in the state of California. And as a result of that, for us to really understand what's happening with the school readiness gap that continues to persist as these children move through the K-12 system, we need to, through our assessments, really get a better sense of what is happening with their learning and development so that we can really develop strategies both at the state level and even programmatically to support teachers and care providers to then help those children continue to grow and learn and develop in the most optimal way. So as we think about assessment, what does that mean in terms of best practices for these children? What it means is that we really need to consider the specific cultural and linguistic characteristics of these children. And in 2008, the National Academies released a publication which specifically called this out as a best practice, as a key recommendation of their report, that when you're going to be doing assessment with early childhood, in the early childhood context, you really need to take into consideration those cultural and linguistic characteristics of the children that you are intending to assess. So what that means for dual language learners is that we know from the research that these children are learning in 2 languages. They're developing 2 different language systems that how that development progresses in each of those languages is influenced by a wide variety of factors, how much exposure they have, how many opportunities they have to use each of those languages, etc. And so to really understand what they know, what skills and knowledge they have, we need to understand that in each of their languages. And this relates not just to what they know in terms of language, but to access how they're learning and developing across all domains, social emotional, math, cognition. We need to really be able to assess them in each of their languages. And this is something that California has really embraced in their approach to assessing all children, and in particular dual language learners. So to get a sense of what that looks like statewide and how the state has approached it, not just with assessment, but across the early learning and development system, we have this graphic that has really been out in use in California whenever something gets released related to infant, toddler, or preschool programming, resources. This is the graphic that we come back to time and time again, because what it highlights for us is right at the center is that key policy lever. in California, it really has been the Learning and Development Foundations, which would be the early learning standards is how we refer to them here in the state of California, at the core. And they exist for infants and toddlers and for preschoolers. And they address a range of domains and specifically call out English language development as a domain focusing on young dual language learners. Then each of the branches that kind of come off of the foundations are aligned to those standards or foundations, and they include program guidelines, curriculum frameworks, professional development strategies, and what I'm going to shift to now and focus again on is specifically assessment. Together, the aim of this comprehensive early learning and development system is to support all young children's development across a variety of early care and education settings. So for assessment, it really has been the Desired Results Developmental Profile, which is a formative observational assessment which addresses children's learning and development across many domains. It's one continuum, and as I mentioned when I opened the presentation, over the past 5 to 7 years, it's really been a process of aligning this assessment to the standards for infant toddler, for preschool, and as a kindergarten piece of this continuum has been developed, aligning it both to the kindergarten standards in California as well as the kindergarten standards in the state of Illinois. As part of the K view of the continuum has been a partnership between California and Illinois' State Board of Education. And the domains that are covered by the instrument are the approaches to learning and self-regulation, excuse me, social emotional development, language and literacy development, English language development, cognition in mathematics, cognition in science, physical development and health, history, social science, visual and performing arts, and in the kindergarten view of the continuum, a Spanish language domain for use in Spanish bilingual classrooms. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of a lag here when I click through on the slide. Okay, so in thinking about the assessment, as I mentioned earlier, the standards are really at the center of this entire early learning and development system. But we also have to remember that assessment is going to be aligned to these standards, but there's no way that it's going to be a one-to-one correspondence. If that was the case, the assessment would be, it would cover way too much material. And what we need to do when focusing with the formative assessment, especially one that's an observational assessment that teachers and assessors are using in the context of the early care and education setting, is to think about what are the most salient, representative, and observable knowledge and skills for each of the domains. So in collaboration with national experts, researchers who developed the early learning and development standards, we worked with them in collaboration with the states and here at West Ed to then determine for each of those domains what are at minimum 4 measures per domain that really get at those salient, representative, and observable knowledge and skills for children. And then specifically when thinking about dual language learners within that broader conversation across the domains, what are those specific cultural and linguistic considerations that we need to address in an assessment that's going to get us valid and accurate data related to where children are at and how we can support them in their learning and development. What those considerations have been are primarily 2. The first has to do with home language. We use that term here in California to refer the primary language, first language. There's lots of other ways to refer to heritage language is another language that I've heard used, a terminology. But when assessors are collecting evidence for rating on all domains, social emotional, physical development, they are in the guidance encouraged to use the home language English, or both. That evidence that's collected, however that child presents it, is to be included as evidence for the assessment. And there are also 3 language and literacy domains. For preschool, it is language literacy development and English language development. And at kindergarten, as I mentioned earlier, that's where the Spanish language domain comes online. The guidance in the, the guidance in the actual instrument in the introduction specifies this acknowledgement of what assessors need to be doing. And this slide actually, I'm not going to read it word for word, but this is actually taken from the introduction to the DRDP for the preschool view. And the guidance acknowledges young dual language learners right from the outset they are developing in 2 or more languages. That's an important thing to acknowledge from the start. So therefore, assessors need to follow the best practice of collecting that evidence in English and the home language. And this may require assistance from an adult who knows the child well and speaks the child's home language. Obviously, if the assessor is a monolingual speaker, they could engage a parent. Parents are allowed to contribute to the documentation. They can engage another staff member, either at their site, in their classroom, or perhaps at another program nearby, or someone from the community who knows the child well. And it also acknowledges that an assessor will also encounter in that observation and documentation the child, the dual language learner doesn't necessarily speak only in English or only in Spanish or Chinese or whatever their home language is, but a typical feature of language development for dual language learners is code switching, which is the use of both of their languages within a conversation or even within the same sentence. And this, again, is something that is a very important best practice to raise, because so often code switching has the misconception and can be viewed as something that's negative, when it actually is an example of how dual language development is different than the monolingual language development experience. But that difference doesn't mean deficit. And instead, it shifts the paradigm a bit in thinking about code switching as a dual language learner tapping both of their resources. They're tapping their home language, they're tapping their English to communicate and to demonstrate the knowledge and skills that they have. So let's look at the second special consideration for DLLs, which I mentioned were those 3 domains. And the first domain is the language and literacy development domain, and this is used with all children, and it assesses children's progress in developing foundational language and literacy skills. And there are 10 measures that address a range of skills and competencies that we would expect a child to make progress in language and literacy development. Again, you can observe and document in the home language, English, or both. The second domain is the English language development domain, and that is for use with English learners or dual language learners only. And it's used to assess progress in learning to communicate in English. And there are 4 measures listed in the instrument, and here are the topics that they cover. But again, key skills and knowledge that we would expect to see development in. And the English language development domain is used in preschool and in kindergarten views. So in thinking about these 2 domains, the key points really are that all children will be assessed using the LLD, and then dual language learners would be assessed with the ELD measures as well. And then the third domain is the language and literacy domain in Spanish. And this domain is for Spanish speakers and also potentially monolingual English speakers who are enrolled in a bilingual program in kindergarten. And this domain focuses specifically on receptive language, productive language, phonological awareness in Spanish, which we know looks different than phonological awareness in English, and early writing in Spanish. So being able to track at that level of specificity, how is that child growing and learning when they have the opportunity to have instruction and curriculum in Spanish. in kindergarten. And so the key point here for the SPAN domain, I've pretty much covered, but really it's the Spanish-English bilingual classes and includes children whose home language is Spanish, as well as children who may speak a language other than Spanish at home but are learning Spanish in the kindergarten context. Again, code switching is mentioned again and again throughout the instrument, and actually examples in the measures show kids, demonstrate kids' use of code switching. So overall, I think just as I close, I would want to point out that I'm focusing here on the DRDP and the use of it as a formative observational assessment tool. It takes into consideration those unique cultural and linguistic characteristics of young dual language learners. It really acknowledges that they are developing in 2 languages, whether they start that at birth or they start it when they enter our infant, toddler, or preschool programs, but that development, their language development, is going to look different than that of a monolingual child, and to truly understand what knowledge and skills and competencies they have, we need to be able to understand and tap into that in both their home language and English. And in California, the early learning and development standards have really been the lever that has really driven that work. The thing I would like to add is that since the BUILD policy brief was released, I know that Miriam and Dr. Espinosa put together, that we have had even preschool program guidelines that have been released that very concretely address programming that supports dual language development. And really the options are providing an English environment with support to the home language, and also a balanced approach where you're intentionally supporting language development of children in both their home language and English, depending on your context and the population of children you serve. So those are 2 new resources that and there's a family engagement framework as well that's come online. But I'll leave it now for questions.
Thank you so much, Annemarie. First question was just sort of clarifying how the statewide data looks from the DRDP KEA, in that are you able to account for whether or not children were assessed in their home language or not, and is this available for all domains?
So can restate the question just again? Is it specifically in terms of whether we know how the evidence is collected, whether it's home language or English?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So
and is that across all domains?
Is that across all domains? So
mm-hmm.
the assessors, which in most contexts are the child care teacher, either in the infant, toddler, or the preschool program, for themselves and how they rate the child, or they rate the measure for each child, they can provide notes as to what evidence they provided. They have to have documentation that they keep, but then they actually just rate a child on a level. We do not require them to specify whether they are assessing the evidence was only in the home language or only in English. The idea is that if we're assessing a child and we're trying to understand their what knowledge and skills they have, say, in social emotional development, I'm thinking of, for example, those measures are identity of self in relation to others, social and emotional understanding, relationships with adults and relationships with peers, that what we want to know is what the knowledge and skills are, and it's our job to really understand where that child is at. We need to be able to collect the evidence in both languages, but it's not necessarily for the purposes of social and emotional development assessment necessary to know, well, half of what I collected was in English and half of what I collected was in Spanish. So that would be my answer. When you come to the very specific domains of ELD and SPAN, then that's different, because as you look at the continuum for those measures, if you were to go and look at the instrument and look at the domain, it starts with evidence that can be in the home language, in ELD measures, home language and English, and then shifts where if you're really focusing on English competency, then we would want to see demonstration of knowledge and skills in English.
Great, thank you. And then can you clarify again the assessment? Is there a DRDP for children ages 3 to 5 and another from birth to 3? Is it a birth to 5 where you see this on a continuum? We've had a couple questions about clarifying the ages.
Sure. So what I would say, so it was separate instruments in the past, and as the early learning and development system was being fleshed out and articulated in California, the state acknowledged that it was important to create one developmental continuum that aligns to the standards, but also looks at development in this as a progression from birth through the kindergarten year, so through the year that the child is in kindergarten, which in California we have transitional kindergarten and kindergarten. As part of that work, the state also realized that if you are an infant toddler teacher, it's important for you to be able to focus on those levels of the continuum that are most relevant to you in an infant toddler context. Same thing if you're a preschool teacher, right? That those levels that are most relevant to the children that you are working with. So there are different views is how it's characterized. So if you were to go to our to the DRDP website, which I'd be glad to provide the links to where you can get the actual assessments, they are available. You will see there is an infant toddler view, there is a preschool view, and there is the DRDPK. But they all are on one continuum. And there is also a online platform for the instrument, DRDP Tech, which is what the state is really moving towards for all practitioners. And that will actually show you your view, but also can show you additional levels, but you wouldn't be allowed to rate on the ones that are not necessarily relevant for your context.
Great. We've had a number of questions, really kind of great questions, thinking about kind of implementation. So how do you, how are you aware of efforts around really training assessors to train on sort of ELD objectives, Spanish language domains? How are you assessing, ensuring language match and sort of the capacity that's needed to shift assessment practices in this way?
So the state has, and this is an area where I can speak to it somewhat, but I've been involved more on the end of supporting the development of a lot of this. So I would encourage people to go to the Desired Results website. A colleague here at WestEd is really who leads the training and technical assistance for the state. But it has been the trainer approach. And so the state offers training. People can go to trainings. And there also has been a real push to develop online modules related to various domains and also assessing dual language learners. And the ELD domain has been online now for several years, so it has been something that the field is aware of, the field is engaged with it, and there are opportunities available for people to pursue professional development. In regards to Spanish, in the California context, it is an optional domain. So, and the assessment itself is not a required KEA assessment. It is one of the options available to kindergarten, either districts at the district level, at the teacher level. It is available, but it is not the required or state mandated assessment. So that's going to look a little different. And in Illinois, there it is a required assessment, and they're in the process of figuring out what that's actually going to look like. What are the required domains for dual language programs? I know the guidance has been that Spanish should be part of what you're looking at, and actually, as it was released and rolled out in the state of Illinois, it was one of the domains that we received extremely positive feedback from the field on, in terms of if they were bilingual teachers, having something that specifically addressed Spanish was not something that they had necessarily encountered in their assessment practices that way that was being rolled out statewide.
Great. And then sort of a couple final questions. We've had some questions about, we know the KEA, the DRDP-K is available for other states, but is the formative, Birth to 5 formative assessment available for other states to use? Does an alignment with Teaching Strategies Gold exist and the DRDP formative assessment? And could you say a little bit about how the tool supports sharing information with families?
Okay, so what I could say is right now in Illinois and in California, we're in the process of working with each of the states to, we've gone back to the experts who worked with us for development for the standards, and also who have then developed the measures to document and flesh out what that alignment actually means. What is that correspondence, right? Because it's not a one-to-one. You're not going to be able to go down and check each little box on the standards and say this standard is here and this standard is here, and this, the assessment would be would be quite long. It would be as big as one of the standards documents. But that kind of correspondence, what does that look like, is in the process of being posted and uploaded to each of the websites for both Illinois and California if you were to go to the desired results. Or in Illinois, it's the kids. It has not been aligned with Teaching Strategies Gold, but I know that it has been through a process in considering and looking at alignment to other state standards as that comes up in the context and working with other states who choose to adopt it. And in terms of sharing the information with families, the online system has different sorts of reports that can be produced to share with families. That can be produced to share where children are at across the domains. And in particular, they are in the process in California of working with the field, working with both practitioners, but also folks that provide professional development in this area, to look at what is the best way to communicate this information with families, and also exploring which languages that information would be important to have it accessible, so that at a push of a button the teacher could then produce a report that really is intended for use with parents, and not necessarily one that is customized to them to use for improving their curriculum and instruction.
Great. And Annemarie, I've shifted to the next slide on an excerpt from the federal policy statement that we've referenced earlier. Sort of any thoughts on from you around the alignment with the federal policy statement regarding KEA and what you've just discussed with us in the about the DRDP?
So, I guess what I would say is that the DRDP itself, again, it's the piece of acknowledging that you need to build in guidance around how we're assessing these children, acknowledging that they are different, but without a deficit perspective. And so as part of that, it's that guidance that I've shared in my presentation regarding the DRDP at all the levels. But I also think it has to do with, even if you, as we continue to partner with California and Illinois with the validity of the instrument and the research studies that are being done on that, is paying attention to who are the children that are being assessed using the instrument, and how are they performing, and what does that mean for the validity of the instrument moving forward. So it's something that at least it is something that both, I think, California and Illinois have been very intentional about and thoughtful in regards to thinking about what those state policies are and how they relate to the federal policy. And again, coming back to viewing the dual language learner as different, that they need special considerations when we think about them in every aspect, what teaching we provide, what assessment we provide, but also that that doesn't mean that it's a deficit perspective.
Thank you so much, Annemarie. We're going to turn to Noel now from South Carolina. As in our earlier poll, for those that were able to participate, we heard that sort of context matters a lot as sort of we're doing this work, and Noel is going to sort of take a case study approach and really tell us how she's been moving the dual language learner agenda forward in her own state. Noel?
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. This is the fastest cross-country trip you've ever made, all the way over to the coast and in South Carolina. So I'm excited to be able to talk to you about sort of our journey that we started and that we're in the middle of. About 2 years ago, we had the opportunity to participate in a diversity and equity learning table. And then the next year, we participated in the DLL learning table with build support. And we had a team that came back, and we looked at our state and looked at where we felt like we were at that point, and just developed a strategic plan for what are the things that we would like to see change, and there were a lot. So the first thing that I would say to you is that we have heard both of the states before me talk about how the early learning standards in their states were the policy lever or the driver for making changes and really impacting the field in terms of this. And so that's really where we started. In the survey or the study that Miriam shared at the beginning, we were one of those English immersion only states that really didn't have a lot in our standards. And I'm happy to say that our draft version now has a nice comprehensive section. But in South Carolina, we had the Good Start Grow Smart standards in 2006. That was only for 3 to 5 year olds. Then in 2008 and 2009, the infant toddler guidelines were added, but they were 2 separate documents and written in 2 different languages. We've been in a revision process, as you can see from the slide, for quite a while. We had Drs. Lynn Kagan and Catherine Scott Little evaluate our standards and make recommendations. And then after the DLL learning table, we brought back that information and made a very intentional commitment to making sure that our standards represented cultural and linguistic diversity and helped supported teachers as they work with children who were culturally and linguistically diverse. So we developed some main goals, if you will, or these are things that we would commit to. And I will tell you that this is a partnership between the State Department of Education and our child care administrator office is really driving this effort. The child care administrator in our state is very supportive of this work, of looking at these issues across our systems, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But these were the 5 big ideas that we wanted to make sure our early learning standards represented or addressed. And you can see the last 2 bullets were specifically targeting cultural and linguistic diversity. And so through Build support and through the support of the learning table, we were able to offer the stakeholders in our ELS revisions a webinar on Dr. Linda Espinosa and Dr. Marlene Zapeta conducted a webinar on the latest research on what other states look like with their DLL standards, and they really informed the group about the current research because, again, we're in English, there was nothing in the standards before that addressed this. So this was it wasn't necessarily a new concept for those of us in early childhood in South Carolina, but thinking about it at a systems level definitely was. And so our standards are currently in draft form. They go out for their second public comment period in, I think, a week. And we have a whole entire introduction dedicated to DLL. We have the WIDA standards embedded, and then we have teaching strategies related to that. And then we also have linguistic and culturally diverse examples of teaching strategies. We have to give a shout out to North Carolina, because what we ultimately did was take their work as a foundation and the good work that they have done and then built upon that. So what I want to talk to you now is, not only were we an English immersion state in South Carolina, but we're an English-only state. So you heard about Washington and California and the great work that they've done. In South Carolina, things are a little bit different. We are an English-only state in legislation, and so that gives us a few barriers that some other states might not have. So those of you that are on the call that are in English-only states that are similar to South Carolina, I'm hoping that you'll hear some of this and some of these lessons learned I'm going to share, and you can relate it to what you're doing in your state. South Carolina has a piece of legislation that identifies English as our language, our state language, right there along with the state bird and the state dog. And but what it did is it went a little bit further in that legislation, and it stated that no state money can be spent on materials in any language other than English. But then it added the second sentence, and it said, unless it is for the purposes of teaching English. So that gives us a little glimmer of hope. It sounds really dark at the beginning, but it does give us a glimmer of hope, because we know through the research that the home language and the child's ability to be proficient in their home language and to continue building that is going to lead to the development of the second language in English. So we can use that research to further, because we heard California talking about assessment. That is not, there is a firm stance at the State Department of Education right now about assessment, and they assess only in English. The state did not do any assessment of children but at third grade until they recently added 4K, state-funded 4K a couple of years ago. So right now we have a real problem with assessing children in English due to this law. So there's several things in South Carolina that hopefully with the work that we're doing on the early learning standards, we're going to be able to drive a lot of change that's going to be really good for linguistically diverse families and children. So I'm just going to take the last couple of minutes to talk about lessons we're learning, because if you're in an English-only state like mine, there are going to be some things that are going to come up and you're going to learn. And one of the things we've learned is that we want to make it a state systems issue. The Child Care Administrator's Office has taken the stance that our early childhood system for birth before public school, that we will promote the DLL research and we will take a DLL approach. So in all of our funded partners and in what we're doing, we're really examining how does that look. So that impacts the QRIS. That's in the middle of revision right now. That impacts our subsidy system. That impacts our CCR&R. We fund that. We fund the Program for Infant Toddler Care. So there's a lot of, we fund our professional development system through our CCDF federal dollars. So there's a wide range of areas that are really going to, we really need to think about this. And I think one of the presenters before me showed a nice spread of how it looks when you're looking at the different areas of systems. It was a nice visual look. And so my second bullet is, does it matter? And people collect data on things that matter. And if you're an English-only state and it's in law, your policymakers, they're not really asking the questions that would drive data collection. So when you make it a systems issue, you're even looking at how are you collecting data. When we're doing our QRIS evaluations, are we finding out about the workforce and if they're monolingual or bilingual and what languages? Are we finding out about the diversity of the children that they're serving? When we're doing subsidy applications, are we collecting information about families and connecting them to supports? So we collect data on things that matter, and we have to look at what we need to know so that that can drive the development of our programs. The third bullet on here is to create an action-oriented agenda. Sometimes you just got to do it. We came back from our DLL learning table. We were psyched and ready to go. And so through Bill's assistance, Dr. Linda Espinosa and Dr. Marlene Zapana, we held 3 statewide webinars. One was for the open to the entire workforce in our state. We had about 500 teachers. We had another one that was for all of our college 2- and 4-year college faculty on the latest research on DLL. And then we had one, as I told you, just for our early learning standards stakeholder group that was doing the revisions. So we just jump in where those opportunities are. So there's certainly great benefit to building community and getting as many people as you can and getting input, but sometimes you just have to do it. And that's kind of what we had to do in our state and look at where can we fit these things in. What are these opportunities that we can add this to? So as I talked to you about, QRIS is in revision. Our state core competencies need to be revised. These are all areas where we're going to be able to fit this right in. We don't have to make a big deal out of it. This is a skill, and these are concepts and competencies that teachers need to have, just like they need to have the competencies in curriculum and in health and physical development. So we're going to add that right in. And then the last thing I would say is going back to what Nicole from Washington said, is building a common language. Now, she had a nice slide with all of these words. What we're doing in South Carolina is just trying to build an understanding of what DLL is, because we're still calling things ESOL, ESL. We do have some things being called ELL, but there's not an awareness of what DLL is. So what we're doing right now is presenting at conferences, doing webinars, taking every opportunity we can, and it's embedded and explained in these new learning standards that what is a DLL and what does that mean, and helping the workforce understand that and what that term means. So building that common vocabulary. And so I hope that this has helped you some if you're a state like South Carolina, and I'm certainly available to anyone that would have questions. There's tons of resources out there, and I'm learning from California's work and Miriam and Linda and Marlene's every day. And so thank you for letting me have an opportunity to present and share this story with you.
Thank you so much, Noel, for being so candid and for all of your work. In the interest of time, I'm going to move us along, but we do have a couple questions for you in the chat box if you want to take a glance at those. But I want to make sure that we've had several questions about resources, and so that is the last section of our webinar. Before I turn it over to Ruth Reinl from the National Center for Development, Teaching, and Learning, who's going to talk to us about these important resources, I do want to quickly mention some very new research that was just released last week from the Arizona Kith and Kin project evaluation, which looked at settings where dual language learners are cared for in family, friend, and neighbor care. This was an effort to provide supports for FFN providers of dual language learners, many of whom are of similar demographic characteristics to young dual language learners and their families. And there were some very positive findings related to improving the capacity of FFM providers serving dual language learners to implement effective early literacy teaching practices, engage in intentional communication, support emergent literacy skills, as well as improve the literacy environments of their homes. There is the link to get the study. Bill will be doing a forthcoming webinar with Dr. Eva Marie Shivers, the lead researcher on this project, but just wanted to make sure folks had that resource too. As we know, family, friend, and neighbor care, again, is a pretty an important setting, particularly for our very young, our youngest dual language learners. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ruth to walk through some resources that there's been a lot of desire for in the chat box. So thank you, Ruth.
Thanks, Miriam. I'm just delighted to be here, and I too was watching in the chat box. So I'm hoping, and some people were asking, where are the free resources? So that's exactly what this section's about. And just know that this is just a sampling of, there's a plethora now of resources available for us to help assist us in supporting dual language learners birth through age 5 and their families. And the resources we're going to be looking at are geared towards families, teachers, caregivers, state leaders, early child care and education systems, program managers, and administrators. So with no further ado, I also have a slide here on the policy statement, which I think people have covered a lot. The only thing I wanted to mention with it, it also gives specific recommendations to early care and education programs about how to partner with families of dual language learners, and actually give some really nice information on identifying and implementing an intentional approach to language use in the classroom, to classroom language models. And so I just wanted to alert you to that part of the policy as well. So getting started is to really go to the Early Childhood Learning and Knowledge Center homepage, or the ECLKC. And if you, this is where you can find updates on the most recent resources that are available for upcoming events and important news updates. It's managed by the Office of Head Start. And the new resources are highlighted and frequently updated right on this screen. And as you can see, this particular screen shows the Dual Language Learner Toolkit, which we're going to be looking at in a minute. But the other piece I wanted to show you on this home page is in the center column. I hope you can see my cursor. At the very, very bottom, it says Cultural and, it got cut off. And that's for the Cultural and Linguistic Responsiveness Center. And at that particular site, which we're going to be exploring, there is information and resources for working with immigrant and refugee families. The multicultural principles are there. There's information on code switching, and I also noticed somebody in the chat room had talked about translanguaging, and I love that term, and that code switching is part of translanguaging. But there's a whole guide on that you can find at that particular site. Also, there's information on assessing linguistically and culturally diverse children that's housed there. And there is also information on the planned language approach, which we'll be looking at, and the Dual Language Learner Toolkit. So when you get to the Dual Language Learners Toolkit, there is a lovely introductory video that talks about why home language development is so important for children who are dual language learners and as they're acquiring English, and the role it plays in actually with school readiness also. So I encourage you to explore that. And the other piece for this tool, the Dual Language Learners Toolkit, I kind of think of this particular site as a one-stop shop. because what they have done is actually organized all of the resources on the Cultural and Linguistic Responsiveness site into this Dual Language Learners Toolkit. And what they've done is it's arranged by different users or audiences. So if you click on the Administrators and Managers button, which this is all located right underneath that little video I showed you, that little icon of the video. When you click on Administrators and Managers, a drop-down menu comes, and it's specific to administrators and managers. So there's items on research, systems, policies, and practices supporting staff development. Teachers, caregivers, and family service staff, that houses information on the importance of home language. And as that applies to teachers, caregivers, and family service staff, there's information supporting learning English, and there's information on professional development. So all around dual language learners. The last particular section is for families, and this gives information on the importance of families, cultures, and languages. But it's addressed to families. There's understanding home language and English language development materials and resources for families in multiple languages. So all of these resources, there are tip sheets, there is research, and what's wonderful is if you are giving trainings or your professional development, you can go to any of these sites. Teachers might want to look at what some of the policies and systems approaches are. And of course, administrators might want to be looking at what teachers are thinking of, what kind of practices are there. And teachers and caregivers and family service staff will of course be wanting to look at information to provide families and some resources to give to families. And this is where you can find it. It's also linked to the planned language approach, so that you get all of the tips, the tip sheets, strategies for families, caregivers, and teachers, program leaders. All of that is housed in that previous slide I showed you under the Dual Language Learner Toolkit. But I wanted to just highlight the planned language approach because it's a comprehensive, systemic, research-based approach, and it's for all children to ensure language and literacy, high-quality services for all children, and it includes dual language learners. So if you can see, it's a 5-piece pie, and it highlights these are the key components involved with the planned language approach. And I know one of the people who worked very much on this would love me to begin with policy, practices, and systems. So this particular section helps leaders and administrators, state leaders, program managers, etc., think about the policies, practices, and procedures that need to be in place to help teachers and caregivers be able to sustain language and literacy development, and through all aspects of the program. And the big 5 for all are those key elements that have been identified for school, that are key for school readiness and success for early language and literacy development. I know most of you are familiar with them: background knowledge, how to access and build background knowledge of children, oral language and vocabulary, book knowledge, concepts of print, phonological awareness, and alphabet knowledge and early writing. And again, this is geared for all children. However, it also gives you ideas for working with dual language learners. The whole planned language approach, everything you find here is research-based. So all the practices, the teaching practices you will find, the tip sheets, is all based on research. So this is a perfect research-to-practice model. There's also a lot of information on ways to provide home language support in different language models. In fact, and I forgot this, that the language models, classroom language models, is housed under the policies, practices, and systems. But as you explore the system, this particular approach, you'll see that all of these things are very linked. So there's pieces for families, again, for caregivers, for teachers, for program leaders about home language support. And then there's specific strategies for supporting dual language learners in English as well and throughout early childhood curriculum. And so I'm looking at the time, and I want to quickly go through this last one. Here are some other features, resources, and key websites that the Office of Head Start wanted us to be able to show you. There's resource guides for starting and operating a child care business, and so that people can learn about all of the requirements that are necessary for high quality programming. Again, I've showed you the Cultural and Linguistic Responsiveness website. But I just want to call your attention to the Head Start Bilingual Glossary. This is really important for people who are involved with interpreting and translating in your programs at multiple levels, and it's a way to have a common language, consistent use of terminology, because we all know how that can go with all the different dialects and the way people interpret. So this gives us a one-stop way of looking at that. And then Early Educator Central is a infant toddler career pathways website. So it gives teachers, administrators, coaches, trainers, and PD systems leaders resources for building competency in their different areas. And Coloring Colorado is a site that many are familiar with. I wanted to just give a shout out to the Talk, Read, and Sing Together Every Day. These tip sheets are in both Spanish and English. They're for families, caregivers, and early learning educators. They're housed in the website for the U.S. Department of Education, and they are really practical and concrete, lovely resources. So I think that covers it, Miriam, and I know we're short on time, so I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. We have some additional resources and references at the end of the PowerPoint, which you will get at the end of this. I also want to mention that the Office of Head Start and the Office of Child Care will be conducting a webinar in Spanish to highlight the DLL Joint Policy Statement and the Dual Language Learner Toolkit on September 20th. There's an e-blast to come soon, so please be on the lookout for that. Our final poll is really about leadership. As we said at the beginning, there's tremendous research. There are resources to help you at the multiple levels you work, at the program level, at the state level, at the federal level. You heard from some great leaders today about the work that they're doing. And so what we really need to create responsive and equitable programs and systems for dual language learners is for all of you to make a commitment as well to be leaders on these issues yourself. So that is our final poll for you. What will you go back and work on in your state to improve your system for dual language learners? And there we go with the results. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nina to close it out for us. But thank you all so much for your engagement, for staying on a few minutes over to learn more about this really important topic. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Miriam, and thank you to our wonderful presenters, and a big thanks to all of the participants who were so engaged and asked such great questions. So as Miriam mentioned, you'll receive the slides and a recording of the call following the conclusion of the webinar, and you can see here that there are several resources that are included at the conclusion of the PowerPoint. So I'm sure those will be helpful for you. So we'll close it out now, and I hope you all have a great afternoon. Take care.